And welcome to today's webinar, our last webinar for this year, dedicated to submarine cable regulation. Today we are welcoming more than 300 participants from all continents and, if I may say, all oceans. Submarine cables are often out of sight, yet absolutely essential to global connectivity, quietly operating beneath the surface, not unlike a yellow submarine, but with far more regulatory questions attached to it. So before we dive into today's topic, let me briefly go over a few practical details. Sorry. So you can send us questions during all the presentation through the question tab. So that will be the arrow A on the screenshot here. You can also download the presentation. That will be the arrow B, and some other documentation. You can also activate captions if you want. That will be in the down in the interface. So we will collect all the questions and during the presentation and address them during the Q&A session. If we are unable to cover all questions live, we will follow up as usual with you by email after the webinar. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short feedback survey that will be launched. As usual, please give us your feedback. It's very valuable to us and it helps us improve future events. And for each completed survey we receive, we will plant a tree. And all we want for Christmas is trees. Now, let me introduce you our speakers who will deep dive into the regulatory aspects of submarine cables. First, we have here in Brussels with me, Elena Scaramuzzi, who is Head of Global Research. She joined Cologne International in 2009, and she led new services developments in the Americas and design and led the launch of our Global Trends service. We have also Javier Morales, who is joining us early morning from Peru. He's a senior analyst for the Global Trends and Americas services, and is leading the research across India, Singapore, and other APAC jurisdictions. He previously worked for Telefonica and the Peruvian telecoms regulator, OCIPTEL. I think that's it for me. Now I pass the floor to my colleague, Elena, and I will go back when it's time for the questions.
So, good morning or good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are now. First of all, I say a few words about Calen International for those who don't know Calen. Calen is a company that has been existing for almost 40 years now. And what we do regulatory intelligence, which is in practical and simple terms, collecting information, updates, and let's say a knowledge basis about the regulation, policies, and laws across different digital sectors. So from telecom, media, digital economy, postal, and we do it across the globe. So our clients use our information to get these updated information and also about implementing aspects in order to make their own decisions, policies, and strategies about in sectors where regulations and policies are very important. So we have clients from all over the world, and typically regulators, governments, but also different commercial entities from industry. So today we talk about submarine cables systems, and the agenda is quite packed. Why submarine cables? In a nutshell, well, Sarah already said that submarine cables are really a very important sector, and this year we launched new research about how submarine cables are regulated from different perspectives. So today we will touch upon four main aspects. So initially, Javier will present the submarine cable ecosystem, and so we'll give an overview of what we found about the current ecosystem of submarine cables. And he will also briefly present about authorization requirements, because this licensing part is particularly complex, and so we will discuss a little bit about these aspects. Then I will discuss two other perspectives of policies that affect this industry. One is about requirements for security and resilience, and then about also what governments are doing, what are the initiatives in support of submarine cables and why. So now I leave the floor to Javier to start with this presentation, and then I will continue and see you later.
Thanks, Elena. Good morning with everybody. Before presenting this overview of the submarine cable ecosystem, I would like to introduce to Africa as an example of a submarine cable system. To Africa, the core network of To Africa was recently completed in November 2025. To Africa offers a good example about the scale and coordination involved in the implementation of these new submarine cable systems. To Africa is the first cable to connect the East and West Africa in a continuous system, connecting also the entire continent with Middle East, South Asia, and Europe. When it was first announced in 2020, To Africa planned to connect 23 countries through 37,000 kilometers. But there, afterwards, in 2021, To Africa expanded that to 33 countries through 55,000 kilometers, making it the longest submarine cable worldwide. With a capacity of 180 terabits per second, To Africa will deliver much more capacity than the total combined capacity that other submarine cables deliver that South Africa currently offer. Who owns To Africa? To Africa is owned by a consortium of 8 companies led by Meta, together with other 7 telecoms operators and international carriers. In this consortium started in 2018 with the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding. After, when it was was released in 2020, even before they expanded the extension, the estimated cost was $1 billion. It was the most expensive submarine cable. That is why these companies choose the consortium model in order for them to reduce costs and share financial risks. Indeed, To Africa uses the latest technology, allowing 17 favor pairs in only one cable, in which each investor owns specific favor pairs. It means each investor owns their own capacity independently. Additionally, to Africa follows an open access wholesale model. It means landing stations offer international capacity in a fair, transparent, non-discriminatory terms. Who built to Africa? In 2019, Alcatel Submarine Networks was selected by the consortium to build to Africa. As we will see later, Alcatel is one of the main few suppliers in the submarine cable value chain. In turn, Alcatel subcontracted different companies for key tasks. For example, it selected the Danish company Fugro for the seafloor survey. How long it took to build to Africa? The core network took nearly 6 years to complete. We will see later, this timeline, this long timeline is normal for projects of this scale. Indeed, in fact, there are several factors that impact in the timeline of a project, the installation of a project, such as the authorization requirements to land the station, but also, for example, the availability of vessels to install the cable, the protection zones, the conflict zones, the condition of the water, among others. But one of the critical factors, as we will see later, for this timeline is precisely this slow and sometimes unpredictable permit process. In the case of Africa, it took nearly 6 years because it required these permits from more than 30 countries. So having this example of Africa, we now move to present an overview of the entire submarine cable globally. There are around 600 submarine cables worldwide in operation or development. More than 300 of these cables are international. It means they connect different countries. Over 95% of this international data traffic is through these submarine cables, while the rest is managed by satellites. Around 1.5 kilometers of submarine cables are in service globally. During the last decade, the sector has invested over $17 billion in these submarine cables. In this last decade, also, half of the kilometers of cable deployed has been installed. So why, if there are so many cables worldwide, why companies keep building cables? So we will see that thanks to advances in the technology, new submarine cables can provide much more capacity at lower costs. It means that despite the fact that submarine cables are built to last 25 years, they usually are replaced before, not because they cannot continue working, but because new cables provide much more capacity and less cost and are more efficient. This case is illustrated perfectly in Europe, where you can see that the 33 newest cables built in the last 5 years provide 74% of the total capacity in Europe, while the 89 oldest cables provide only 2% of this total capacity. So that is why countries, as you will see in the next slide, different countries are interested in connecting their coasts to these new submarine cables. Globally, there are more than 180 countries connected to some of these international cables. 22 countries are reached with more than 15 cables. Among them, some of them are considered digital hubs, but the majority of countries, more or less over 60 countries, only have connection to one international or two international cables, what make them this is a dependency for disruptions, for example, no? It's vulnerable. They are vulnerable for disruptions. Most of these countries are placed in Africa. That is precisely why this to Africa cable is so important. But analyzing cable landing points per country only bring us a partial picture. As we will see in the next slide, submarine cables connect different regions through oceans and continents. So analyzing the roads of this region is also important because it allows us to see where the traffic is concentrated and also where the risk is shared among countries. For example, if in a particular zone there is a problem that could affect several countries. In this chart, you can see that different routes, different corridors in Americas, Australasia, Transatlantic, and Trans-Pacific, all of them are investing year by year in new capacity. However, that they vary in the amount of capacity in the period. So that is important to consider when analyzing global connectivity trends. So now we move to analyzing how this ecosystem operates that we showed before with the example of two African who owns these cables and who supplies these cables. There are different ownership models. Two of them mainly. One, when one company is the owner of this cable, this owner could be a private telecoms operator, a big tech company, a state-owned entity, or an investment fund. And also consortiums formed by these different kind of operators that usually are conformed with long international cables, as we saw with to Africa. Regarding suppliers, there are different suppliers in the value chain of submarine cables that provide, for example, repeaters, cables, fiber. But to simplify, we could say that there are four main kind of services. One, those companies who manufacture the cables and related hardware. The other ones who make this conduct the survey of the seafloor to see what route is the appropriate to install the cable. Other companies who provide the vessels to install the cable. And finally, once the cable is already installed, companies who provide the maintenance and repair of these cables. We will see that there are a few companies who provide these services worldwide. And once the cable is connected in the land station, usually owners of a consortium of the or owners of the land station has also partnerships with other local operators who control data centers or terrestrial networks, which finally will provide the service to end consumers, users, and businesses in that particular country. So this is the big picture. So we will see in the next slide what is the trend regarding the ownerships, the share of ownership. We saw before that in the 90s, the main owners of these cables were mainly private telecoms operators, incumbent operators. We see that more than 53% was owned only by one sole private telecom operator. When considering consortiums, these operators own more than 80% of these cables. But in the last decade has been a move in these trends, no? With the emergence of these new content providers, the so-called big tech companies like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, who are, because they are consuming a lot of traffic, they realize that instead of leasing services from telecoms operators, it was better for them, more economic sense for them, will their own cables in order for them to use these cables, the capacity at lower cost. And that is why in the last few years, basically since 2018, 2019, these big tech companies have started building their own cables along or through consortiums. Nowadays, these big tech companies own more than 50 submarine cables along or in consortium. Most importantly, they are the owners who are investing the most in new cables. And as we said before, new cables are the ones who have more capacity. And we will see in the next slide, in the case of Europe, for example, you will see that in different routes in Europe, big tech, there are different shares of this ownership, but big tech companies are particularly investing a lot in certain routes. For example, the route that connects Europe with the United States, where considering big tech companies alone are in consortium, they control more than 90% of capacity in that route. So that is a global trend to see regarding ownerships of submarine cables. And finally, regarding suppliers, in the next slide, you can see too that, as we said before, there are very few companies who are the main suppliers through the main services to install, repair, or manufacture these submarine cables. Alcatel from France, Subcom from the United States, NEC from Japan, and HM Tech from China. But there are other important players too, but even with those players, in total, there are very few players in the market. And that, for regulatory purposes, that implies strategic risks of dependence. And also, for example, in the case of repair vessels, there are few repair vessels around the world. And if there is a fault in a cable, there are only few repair vessels who can go to that particular point. Those vessels generally are placed in particular points, and they work through a pool agreement with certain countries. You know? For example, in the case of India, India has an agreement with 2 vessels in Singapore and Dubai to provide this kind of repair vessels in case of a fault, because India doesn't have a national vessel, so it is dependent of these international vessels. And if there is a fault in different places, there is no India, for example, cannot mandate those vessels to go to India instead of the other countries. No? So that is why this type of few players in this supply chain it works as a strategic risk for countries and regulators. So now that we have this overview of this submarine cable market, now we will go to the topic of authorization requirements for both installation and repair of submarine cables. As you see, you will see in the next slide, is UNCLOS is the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. Is one of the pillars for international law in this topic. Under international law, to simplify, in the territorial sea, states have full authority. In the exclusive economic zone, states can regulate the installation and repair of submarine cables. But in high seas, states have no sovereignty. So, but international law grants the freedom to companies to install and repair vessels in those oceans and high seas. So when we talk about authorization requirements by states, we have to take in mind that it means authorization requirements inside the territorial sea and the exclusive economic zone. We will see in the next slide the framework, the regulatory framework of submarine cables is very complex. It includes international agreements, different national laws from different sectors, several private contracts between the owners of the consortium, but also between the owners of the consortium with the partners in the landing stations, and the owners with the suppliers, and the suppliers with the subcontractors. So there are a lot of private international law applying there. Okay. So when we are talking here about authorization requirements, it means authorization requirements by the states, the coastal states. Basically, we could divide this in 2 kinds of requirements. The so-called permits in principle, that, for example, the authorization requirements to land and operate one land station in the country. That in theory, this is under responsibility of the cable owners. In the case of to Africa, for example, the owners of the consortium usually have partnerships with local operators, and those local operators in their respective countries were the ones who asked for these kind of permits to land the stations. Sometimes these telecom operators were the same telecoms operator, but other times they don't, no? They partner with other local telecoms operators. And on the other hand, there are operational permits that are all permits to perform the work. In our case, this applies for the permits of repair vessels, foreign repair vessels who want to enter territorial waters or economic zones to repair the vessels. In this case, this is usually under the responsibility of the contractor of the repair, the foreign repair vessel. So this is the two kinds of regulation, authorization. We will see in the next slide how it applies for the installation, for landing cable stations in countries. You see here the big picture. This is a chart for Europe, but it represents also the situation in several parts of the world. As we said before, with the case of Africa, installing a submarine cable is a long process. You see here that in Europe, it takes around between 2 or 4 years to deploy this infrastructure. And one of the main reasons why this deployment is long is because precisely what we're talking about, the requirement authorizations to land these stations, these permit in principles, that, as we said before, it's not that it's one permit in principle only by one authority. There are several authorities in one country who have the power to give this authorization, this permit, this license. For example, in Europe, most of the countries don't have a specific license for landing station. They only require general authorization for providing telecom services. So that is why these telecom operators are the partners of owners, of other owners, to install the cables in their countries. However, in Europe, there are other authorities, particularly the environmental authority, who also ask for these permits. They usually require a previous analysis, environment impact analysis. And as for documentation of this seafloor survey that could cause damage, for example, to archaeological sites of fishery, among others. So these usually take, this permit take between 10 to 12 months in Europe. But in other countries, this process is longer. In the United States, for example, the Federal Commission has a particular license for landing station. However, the Federal Commission don't provide information about the timeline that this authority has to provide that license. So it will evaluate that case by case, depending on security reason, it could take longer. Usually, it could take as long as 2 to 3 years to securing of this permit, and only by the Federal Commission. But there are other authorities. For example, in India, the Department of Telecommunication is the authority in the telecom sector who allow this permit. And only this department takes up to 2 years to give the license. But apart from this authority, submarine cables have to ask license for other 4 ministries: the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Home Affairs, the Minister of Environment, and the Minister of Defense. That, without counting with all municipes for rights of ways, and etc., etc. So that is why different countries will provide their own rules And that is why this process is slow, complex, and uncertain. And now it is not surprising that to Africa took 6 years to deploy this submarine cable through 30 countries. No? Next, we move to the other authorization requirement, that is an operational permit request, that is for foreign repair vessels to operate in territorial seas or exclusive economic zones. In this case, there are certain countries that have specific licenses for repair vessels, foreign repair vessels. But even if those other countries don't have a specific license for repair vessels, the majority of countries have certain permits for foreign vessels, not necessarily for repair vessels, but for foreign vessels. That is part of the cabotage law in several countries, for example. In Asia, several countries under the cabotage law or fishery law restrict the entrance of these foreign vessels. They prioritize their own national vessels. That is the case, for example, of Indonesia, who have their own repair vessels. Curiously, even India, who doesn't have a national repair vessel, also have 7 authorities who require permits for these foreign repair vessels. So if there is a fault, even if it's an emergency fault, these repair vessels have to ask for this permit for 7 authorities. And one of these permits take several days or weeks. So obviously, many companies, organizations inside India are discussing about this problem. India itself, the regulator of India is proposing measures to have their own national repair vessels. This is a trade-off between security and safe of these repairing these faults. But in the case of Europe, for example, authorities, there are certain countries who give this permit for 3 years, and without, even if there are faults or not, during 3 years you have your permit. And there are other countries who provide permit case by case, every fault. Some permits in some countries are few days, others are few weeks. So this is not is an homogeneous issue, and so it is the same as the case of authorization requirement for landing points. These authorization requirements in general, as we will see in the next section, or Elena will discuss, is interlinked with security and resilience issues. So Elena.
Yeah, now we will discuss security and resilience, and essentially there are different aspects where industrial and policy making are really very close together, because when we talk about security and resilience, essentially we talk about 4 main aspects. One, considering that the general objective is to have this infrastructure as protected as possible. So this is a requirement that exists everywhere for investors. So let's say that there are different aspects that are also addressed by policymaking and regulation. One is about the safety by design. One is about special rights and obligations. We said that there are many contracts that really are present in for the functioning of this industry. But as a matter of fact, these special rights and obligations are also sometimes reflected in binding policies and the laws, and we will discuss that in a moment. Then there are some monitoring and and detection requirements. Let's say this is really about the security reviews and cybersecurity requirements that must be complied with for this infrastructure. And then there are also some aspects regarding the response and repair when there are some vulnerabilities. And as was discussed before, vulnerabilities can have different kind of sources. Let's say they might come from even non-human aspects, like environmental events, for example, that may damage submarine cables. That is what happened a couple of years ago in off the coast of Nigeria, and all West Africa was affected in its submarine cable systems for these natural events. But there are also the human events that may cause damages, and this can be intentional or non-intentional. So generally they are non-intentional, but of course there are also risks of sabotage, and these are also addressed by recent policies that we observed around the world. So let's say that one example of safety by design is about the routing, the defining of where to pass the submarine cables in the territorial waters and the exclusive economic zones, as was explained by Javier. And in our analysis that, let's say, we analyzed in our research really jurisdictions from all continents, and we saw that in several countries, for example, they started adopting these protection zones that are some corridors that are especially designed and defined in order to pass submarine cables where activities like, for example, fishing or anchorage and so on are completely prohibited. That is the case, for example, of Australia, that where the telecommunication law already established this kind of golden standard for protection zones, because in practice, when applying for a landing station, in practice, operators may decide whether to pass this infrastructure in protected zones. And in these protected zones, let's say there are more safety standards, but also liability regimes when it comes to, for example, damages to the infrastructures, and so there is it's a type of let's say of license that somehow encompasses a number of rights also for those who want to pass the submarine cables on that in that zone in particular. And this type of approach, however, is also observed in other countries that we have studied. So the protection zone, the corridor is typically it is 1 kilometer wide, so 500 meters from each of the two sides of the cable, essentially. And we see that we have a similar principle, although sometimes it's not named in an identical way. But for example, in China, there is this kind of zone. So the protected zones are defined, and also with different width, depending on the type of coastal site. So even in, for example, in smaller areas like small gulfs, they are, for example, 200 meters instead of 1 kilometer. So it really depends. And also we see the same type of approach in, for example, in both in Japan and Korea, the respective ministries may define and assign these kind of corridors and protected zone. And the same for Singapore, and that is under a circular in the port, issued by the Port Authority, where they define exactly what are the protections standards that are given to submarine cables. And we see that this is has proven so successful in many respects from an industrial point of view that other countries are considering the establishment of protection zone. That is the case, for example, of Brazil in a law that was presented this year, and also India has been discussing this possibility. In other parts of the world, there are other type of protections, which of course are studied case by case in our benchmark. But of course, it's interesting, in my opinion, to see that there is this kind of regulatory standard that somehow is gaining traction worldwide. Then let's say another aspect that we see in the next slide is about mandatory security assessment. And we studied what are these mandatory security assessments in our benchmark. And we saw that, for example, there is diversity also in this case. For example, an annual cybersecurity vulnerability assessment that must be conducted every year in Brazil, and then this is reviewed by the regulator Anatel. There is a standard, very interesting, in Egypt, because here, let's say, there are the National Telecommunication Authority has established some ex-ante requirement when, let's say, there is a permit application for the establishment of landing stations in Egypt. And in that case, let's say they must also establish, for example, the network operation center must be within Egypt, and also some operational protection plans must be part of the license application. So an applicant must not only submit, let's say, and present what is the type of plan for the submarine cable, but also what are the security standards that will be applied, and also what are the redundancy and technical solutions in case of emergencies that must be complied with. And also there are these very punctual compliant assessments on these requirements on the licensees by the regulator. So, and then let's say in the case of the UK, for example, the standard is more like having some periodic national risk assessment reviews for different type of infrastructures that are considered of very strategic importance. And these assessments are then published in the National Risk Assessment Register. So it's something that is carried out, let's say, periodically at national level in the UK, that we have seen is one of the most important country in terms of submarine cable systems in the world. Then let's say about sovereign fleets of repair vessels. This is really a new debate. We have seen from what Javier just presented that this is really can be a bottleneck, a huge bottleneck at industrial level, but due to also geopolitical issues and new debates that are emerging at global level, we see a trend of proposing, let's say, having this kind of sovereign fleets for also increase on one hand, let's say, the functioning and improve the functioning of the systems and address emergency situation, like in the case of India, for example. In Europe, it was presented as a possibility in a cable security action plan that was presented in February this year. And one of the possibilities really to establish a EU-funded fleet of emergency repair vessels because of, let's say, the increasing risks or perceived risk of possible damages or even sabotage in certain parts of Europe. And the US already has two vessels that are actually used for emergency repairs of cables of US national security. And these are, in practice, the cable security fleet. One is placed on the Atlantic Ocean, the other on the Pacific Ocean, and in practice, these vessels intervene in case of emergencies and damages. So, but in other countries also, this is a topic of high relevance. For example, in China, under the 14th five-year plan for maritime sector, there is really an intention to enhance the capabilities of repair vessels in operating in the China Sea. And in practice, there are a number of activities that are being implemented to, let's say, reinforce the industry at the national level. And same for other countries in Asia and even in Nigeria, even if it's not really related with the, let's say, security concerns. It is more about really making the infrastructure more resilient in that part of the world. And there have been debates about how to intensify and improve availability, because when there was the rupture, the vessels had to come from, one came from the UK, the other one was coming from South Africa, and that demonstrates that it took quite a long time for these vessels even to arrive to the area of where the rupture had occurred. So there is another small angle that I will discuss very, very briefly, and this is also part of the policies in support of submarine cables. And in practice, there are three main areas of, let's say, public policy intervention. So there are, let's say that in some countries, it's really a mix of these approaches. I'm not saying that everything is really black or white, but still, let's say there are some countries where there are policies that are aimed at attracting investment in submarine cables. And one example is Nigeria, that is really having a number of financial and non-financial incentives to attract investment, including foreign direct investment in the submarine cable industry, to increase resilience, of course, to have as many cables as possible, and also in line with the ambition of the country to develop its digital economy. So there are a number of measures. Some of them are really regulatory or operational guidelines that attract this type of investment, also from foreign entities, and also some tax benefits, for example, for essential equipment and so on. Let's say another example is really strengthening the domestic industry in this case. China is the typical example. I mentioned before let's say the efforts to improve the repair vessels and the fleets, also for maintenance and for let's say for laying the cables and so on. So becoming increasingly a strategic industry also for for supporting third countries in that regard. and the government supports the research and development in this sector, and also the construction of vessels themselves. And there is other countries are really trying to strengthen their domestic industry, also to export somehow some capabilities. And also there are several economies in, for example, Japan is also supporting a lot its national industry and strengthening its national industry for, you know, in a sector that is under great expansion worldwide. And then there are regional collaborations, and this is about governments that have been supporting submarine cables projects. For example, the case of Australia in the Indo-Pacific region, with the funding of some undersea cables, sometimes in partnership with some players, and also, for example, in support of smaller countries, for example, in the Pacific, or Papua New Guinea, for example. There is this project that was announced recently about enhancing and laying new cables, reinforcing connectivity also in that part of the world, and that is seen as something in partnership also with other governments. That is the case of Australia, which partners, for example, under the quadrilateral partnership also with India, Japan, and the United States, and they have relevant collaboration in this sector. So there are many more examples I could give, but I would like to give just a wrap up of what we discussed. So to conclude, what are the main takeaways of our research? First of all, that submarine cables have been increasing both in industrial and in geopolitical relevance, and that is a fact, and there is no more to say about it. It's a sector that is really growing. But there are also new trends in availability and ownership, also as regards policy and regulation. And licensing remains a highly critical issue, and our research addressed these aspects in considerable detail. And also there is increasing attention worldwide on the protection and the resilience aspect of submarine cables, with governments and their policies and laws that are really having a growing relevance for this sector that traditionally has been a commercially driven sector. So I don't know if there is time for questions. I think it's almost 5. I don't know, Sarah.
We received a lot of questions, so I just want to remind our participants that we will clearly don't have the time to answer all questions, but we promise we will get back to you by email. We always do. I think you are all used to our webinars now, so you know we will keep that promise. Also, I think we can take at least 2 questions, but I also wanted to remind participants that the webinar is being recorded, that you will get the link to the recording tomorrow by email. And yeah, and so maybe we can just take a first question very quickly. So is it common to see restrictions on the ownership and exploitation of submarine cables? I don't know, Elena, perhaps you want to reply to that?
Yeah, well, this is something we addressed in our benchmark, but very briefly, there are different situations. Very few countries place some ownership restrictions as such, but that is the case, for example, of, I don't know, for example, in the case of Indonesia, there is a 5% reserved ownership for national telcos. So that is, for example, a requirement that exists there. There is also a requirement in China about majority-owned ownership of Chinese entities for the strategic submarine cables that are classified as critical information infrastructure. But then there are, for example, some kind of reviews of foreign direct investment, and these requirements apply in many countries, from Australia, but also in the UK and so on. So it really changes case by case. It is very, let's say, every country has its own standards about foreign ownership of this type of infrastructure.
Thank you, Elena. And maybe one question for Javier, so we are equal. Javier, how does competition law apply to submarine cables? Very briefly.
Yes. Well, competition law, well, submarine cables are like other telecom service. In this case, they are under competition law, they are considered essential facilities who provide wholesale access services to international connectivity. But precisely, for example, in the case of to Africa, as we said before, it's like one of the owners of the consortium in the Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, joined with Airtel, Orange with Airtel to form a joint venture. In this case, as those two operators provided services in different countries in that region, it was analyzed for the competition authority of the Eastern and Southern Africa, no? COMESA. And this particular authority analyzed if this market was integrated in the mobile telecom market and in the landing station, and they authorized the joint venture. So this is there are many issues regarding competition and
Yes.
Thank you, Javier. Well, again, really sorry we cannot take more questions right now, but I promise we will. Well, Elena and Javier will reply by email, and
we will during the holidays. We will promise.
So just don't forget to give us feedback. It's super important. We will plant trees, so it's also good for the planet. You'll get the recording tomorrow, answers to your questions by email. Just a quick note that our offices will be closed from 24 December to January included. We will be back on 5th of January, I guess you know, and we will be back for a very special year as 2026, sorry, will be the 40th anniversary of Cologne International. So stay tuned. We have some surprises for you, and more webinars, more trainings, more reports, more research, and yeah, stay tuned. And Happy New Year to everyone, and we wish you all the best for this holiday season with all your loved ones. And yeah, see you next year, everyone. Bye-bye.